Hello, and welcome to Team Australia's Cybersecurity Risk Assessment. Today we will cover multiple areas of the risk assessment, starting with cyber intrusion. Then we'll take a look at current measures for authentication, authorization, and access control. Next, we'll cover the elements that are encompassed within vulnerabilities and threats and conclude with our recommendations. So what is cyber intrusion? It is an attack launched from one or more computers against another computer or an entire network. There are 5 stages to cyber intrusion. They include recon, intrusion and enumeration, malware insertion and lateral movement, data exfiltration, and cleanup. During the recon stage, the threat actor researches and learns as much as they can on their target and their system. To do so, they use various techniques such as social engineering and phishing to gather information. In the second stage, the hacker has gained access at this point and will now begin to ingrain themselves in the network traffic to find data to exploit or deploy tools to perpetrate more damage. Next will be the malware insertion and lateral movement stage, where the attacker will open more channels to access the network and deploy malware such as Trojans and backdoors to come and go as they please. In addition, they will likely implant additional software to give themselves authorization to move freely throughout the network with privileges. Stage 4 is when the attacker begins to remove or steal the data from the systems. Finally, during cleanup, the hacker cleans up any traces of their presence and leaves, but usually not before they leave a back door should they want to return to steal more information or inflict more damage to the system or network. While several weak links can and do exist within the system and the network, the biggest weak links are its users, as well as poor cyber hygiene. It is ultimately the owner or operator's responsibility to protect their devices. If they are not aware of or vigilant to the risks of cybersecurity, the computers and the networks don't stand a chance. By practicing good cyber hygiene, the risks of cyber intrusion are greatly decreased. It is imperative that operators maintain their devices regularly and develop an ongoing maintenance system for them to help to identify any vulnerabilities as well as discouraging future attacks. Now let's discuss some common best practices to restrict access to the systems and networks that can be put in place. The 3 we will discuss are authentication, authorization, and access control methods. Authentication is described as the process of verifying whether or not someone is who they really are and what they claim to be. Typically, users are identified by a user ID and are authenticated via passwords. While this may help to deter some hackers, it is advised to use multi-factor authentication. As of January 2019, the Australian Signals Directorate has implemented multi-factor authentication to create multiple layers of security. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre defines the multi-factor authentication as a method that utilizes 2 or more authentication factors to authenticate any single claimant to a single verifier. The factors that make up the request must include 2 or more of something that the claimant knows, has, or is. What someone knows can include passwords and personal identification numbers or PINs. What a claimant has includes U2F security keys, also known as a physical token or card, smart cards, and physical one-time PIN tokens. What a claimant is refers to biometrics such as their fingerprints or scan of their iris. Other methods also include verification via mobile applications, SMS messages, emails, or voice calls. Be advised, multi-factor authentication is not to be confused with multi-step authentication. Multi-step authentication is more of an architectural approach to access information sequentially, where the verifier grants access or permission increasingly until the desired level is achieved. Although this can be used to increase the security of the system, it can also make it easier for an intruder to bypass it because there is no single point within the system that uses 2 or more factors, allowing the attacker to gain more and more access without having to overcome the multi-factor authentication. Next, let's discuss authorization. Authorization is the process by which a verifier, or in this case, a server, determines if the claimant has permission to access a resource, files, or any other data. It's typically coupled with authentication so that the server can decipher who the claimant is requesting access. It's important to know how authentication and authorization works together. As discussed in the slide before, authentication essentially verifies who the user is. Once the user's credentials are authenticated, authorization verifies what their rights are and determines what they are authorized to access and where they can go in the system. Some examples of this are a person's access to certain floors or areas of a building, such as a government building or in hotels. This is also applied to programs and what types of changes a user can do on it. In addition, most users have used authorization controls when setting parental controls on computers as well as their TV programming. Access control is a security technique that regulates who or what can access the data in the computer or network. In addition to determining how users interact with the data, they also protect data from unauthorized alteration or disclosure, thus minimizing the risk of unauthorized access. Physical access control can refer to limitations to places such as buildings, rooms, computers, and other physical IT assets. Logical access control restricts access to networks, files, and data. There are 5 main types of access control: mandatory, discretionary, role-based, and attribute-based. In mandatory access control, the users cannot decide who has access to their files, but those who have the defined level of authority do. The rights are determined by a central authority, such as the government. In discretionary access control, the access control is regulated by those who own the data or the administrators of the protected system. In role-based access control, the access is restricted to those with defined functions, such as executives versus an entry-level engineer. This control system relies heavily on a role structure and their assignments. In rule-based access control, the rules that govern the access to the data are defined by the system administrator and can be centered around conditions such as time of day or location. In attribute-based access control, the access rights are managed by assessing various rules, policies, and relationships of the user. Since all of these types of access control are helpful at keeping intruders at bay as well as ensuring that confidential information stays away from the hands of unauthorized individuals, the Australian government utilizes a sort of hybrid to regulate their access control. In some areas, they use the mandatory and discretionary access control framework, but utilize the role-based access control as the overarching type that also reinforces the mandatory and discretionary access controls. Next, we will discuss some of the major vulnerabilities and threats to us currently. Vulnerabilities are essentially flaws or weaknesses within the computer system or network that can leave it exposed to a potential attack. In order to exploit a system's vulnerabilities, attackers use attack vectors. Attack vectors are the means they use to access a computer or server to unleash a payload or engage in malicious activity. Be advised, these vectors are not limited to systems and are often used on people as well. Attacks can be launched on both hardware and software alike, and while attacks on software are more frequent, hardware attacks are just as devastating. Hardware attacks involve the direct exploitation of the electronic components of a system and are most effective for interconnected objects. Keep in mind, while software presents the most risk to hardware, most hardware vulnerabilities are software-based. One of the biggest problems with older computers is that much of the equipment does not have the built-in security features, such as the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface with Secure Boot, which is a self-healing basic input-output system or BIOS. Hardware attack vectors are also common in computers without pre-boot authentication or a trusted platform module, as they both provide added level of protection. An example of this is when virtual machine guests are allowed to operate in a virtualized environment to benefit from the hypervisor. Other hardware at risk are old routers, especially those that were manufactured before 2012, and drivers that do not have self-encrypting capabilities like those released before 2009. Next are software attack vectors. These include phishing, which is responsible for 90% of all successful cyber attacks, malware, drive-by downloads, denial of service attacks, which are devastating mostly for businesses such as banks and other e-commerce websites, and domain shadowing that typically follows a successful attack episode such as phishing. An exploit kit is a software system that is a standard tool that hackers use to break into systems. In addition to these tactics, another vulnerability is out-of-date productivity software because many of them that are currently running are unpatched older versions, such as Windows 2002 and 2003. Vulnerabilities can also occur through legacy custom applications that could be out of date and not maintained due to developers no longer working on them. One of the most common attack vectors today involve exploiting the unpatched vulnerabilities in operating systems. Hackers take advantage of these holes to inject codes to take advantage of programming bugs that exist. Code injections such as SQL injections and cross-site scripting are often used and transferred from websites and local applications. Some ways to decrease the chances of attack to the operating system are to remove the services, applications, and protocols that are not necessary to the system because it decreases the attack surface. Also, use least privilege and antivirus software. Finally, use best practices and hardening guidelines available such as CIS and NIST. Telecommunications can be attacked as well through user authentication or SIP toll fraud hacking. Human factors also play a big part in cyber intrusions as they are one of the biggest threats to cybersecurity. Using social engineering techniques, hackers are able to gather information not only regarding their own accounts, but information regarding the network. They are also easily lured into opening emails with malware and willingly accept applications and devices that spread malicious coding. They also leave their devices unsecure a lot of the time and violate network standards and policies, sometimes without even knowing it. Now let's move on to the attribution analysis. Attribution analysis is the process of determining the person or persons behind an attack, their sponsors, as well as their motivation for the attack. The attribution process begins as soon as knowledge of the cyber incident has occurred. There are two goals of the attribution analysis. The first is to determine if the errant behavior is intentional or accidental. The second is to identify the party responsible for the actions. In order to identify the culprit behind the attack, there are three key factors to define. The first is to determine the machines that were used to facilitate the intrusion at the conference. The first machine that will likely be identified is the one that is in the same proximity as the conference. It's important to identify any other machines the intrusion was routed through to path out additional links in the multi-stage intrusion. It was discovered that several computers linked to the intrusion were located in various parts of the world. The investigators will then subpoena the service providers to reveal the subscribers' names. Another source of information for attribution is by using a honeypot to monitor any suspect's behavior. In addition, preposition instrumentation can be utilized to help identify the source and nature of the activity. Next, attributing the intrusion to a person or persons is a little more difficult compared to finding the machines involved. Since anyone could have used another country's IP address to mask their own or could have stolen login credentials, technical forensics is not always sufficient to identify the facilitator. To aid in this search, investigators could begin by reviewing historical records of past attacks and compare which IP addresses have been used in Chinese or Russian attacks. We can also consult various online discussions infiltrated by Australian intelligence. We can look for clues on topics such as government security measures. The final step is attributing to the party that is ultimately responsible for the intrusion. Even if we find the facilitator, they may be acting on someone else's behalf, whether it's for an organization, country, or another person. Typically, if there is a cybercrime against a state, it is motivated by political agenda. In cases like these, it's imperative to examine the relationships between the states to narrow down the culprit and their motive. As you can see here, we've developed a matrix to break down our emerging vulnerabilities and threats. attack vectors, and resources to mitigate risks. They've also been rated on how much of an impact the vulnerability is to our systems and networks. With each attack vector, there are vulnerabilities and threats as well as the risks that exist. In an effort to limit and control the impact, we have identified ways to mitigate those risks. This brings us to a more in-depth look into the risks in our recommendations. Here you see a list of the biggest risks we currently have. Unfortunately, some of the hardware currently in use are old and do not have much protection built into them. Some of the software in the operating system we use could also be lacking in security patches that were released to fix existing vulnerabilities. That being said, the antivirus software could also be outdated, rendering it useless to any new threats. Another risk is the slow policy updates, meaning that the rate at which the standards and policies are being created and released is much slower than the rate at which the attackers find new ways to infiltrate the system. And of course, there is the biggest threat of them all, the human element. Some of the risks that come with the users is that their privileges on the network far exceeds than that of what they actually need for their roles and responsibilities. In addition, many people are not aware of the existing threats or lack the training on cybersecurity to know what to look for or even how to report it. They also fall victim to social engineering, which puts the system, the network, all the other users, and those who they interact with in danger. A risk that is both current and new is the geopolitical relationships that are formed through various dealings such as the Five Eyes Summit. No one truly knows the full intentions and motivations of another person or state, which makes it difficult to decipher whether or not to trust or invest in the relationship. We are all at the summit to share knowledge under the premise that all the countries participating are friendly. Therefore, when an intrusion occurs and it's internal, everyone becomes a suspect, old or new relationships alike. Because we are not privy to what everyone is using at the summit, any new piece of technology is also a new risk, because we have yet to analyze and fully understand their capabilities. In addition, since more and more people are relying on their mobile devices to store and transmit data, attackers are constantly developing new mobile malware. The same is true for cloud storage. Due to its convenience and reliability, more data is being stored in the cloud than ever before, increasing our attack surface. And as always, any developed malicious coding poses a new threat. Although we don't want to incur any risks, they will always exist. The only risk Australia is willing to accept is the one that comes with developing geopolitical relationships. Since cyberspace knows no bounds, it is difficult to completely cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. All we can do is acknowledge the presence of risk with each new relationship and proceed with caution. As for the rest of the risks, the best course of action is to continue developing strategies to mitigate the various risks. With that, we move to risk mitigation strategies. First, let's tackle information system hardware from the vulnerability matrix seen previously. While we would like to ensure that all of the equipment utilized are the most up-to-date, state-of-the-art technology, it is near impossible because it changes so rapidly. Because of this, we recommend upgrading old routers and drivers with self-encryption to employ the pre-boot authentication, as well as make use of the Sure Start technology to detect any corrupt or compromised BIOS codes. Next, we must ensure that all security patches for our applications are up to date and harden user applications to control those that have the ability to perform unwanted actions such as running Flash without permission. In addition, we must ensure that our macro configuration blocks the execution of untrusted macros. Strategy for the human factor is a little more difficult to execute as it heavily relies on the users themselves. It's imperative that the team ensures that administrative privileges are limited to only those who need it. There is absolutely no reason for there to be a lot of users with this type of access. We will continue to require multi-factor authentication, but occasionally alter or swap the type of authentication required. Finally, we cannot stress enough how important it is to train users on cybersecurity awareness, not only to let them know of the risks, but also to inform them of the resources available and educate them on how to respond should an attack occur. Lastly, all operating systems must be upgraded to the latest standard and install any and all security patches released. Furthermore, antivirus software has to be installed, and we should deploy a combination of an intrusion detection and prevention system. In conclusion, in order for us to ascertain the threats to our systems and networks, it's imperative to reflect on the current standards by which we access our data, as well as understand the vulnerabilities and threats that exist both internally and externally. Should an intrusion occur, such as now, we must respond accordingly and quickly. There are several ways to determine the attributing factors to cyber activity. As presented, cyber attacks involve several elements and typically occur in multi-stages, not only to gain as much access to data as possible, but to also hide their identity. By utilizing various tools, scripts, and programs to analyze metadata, as well as examining the geopolitical relationships that exist between the states, we will be able to better understand the damage done, the motive behind the attack, and identify the party or parties behind the attack. Once completed, it's crucial to reevaluate our risk management strategies to decrease the likelihood of another attack. This is why the Australian government's Cybersecurity Centre developed the essential aid to help mitigate those risks. Threats and risks will forever exist as long as there is data. Therefore, we must do whatever it takes to continue increasing our cyber resilience. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for joining us today for our cybersecurity risk assessment.